Not a
Mayor,
bad
should I
idea,
start?
John. Thank you.
Please.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming
Sure,
tonight to our informational about short-term rentals.
Go
The
fine.
city has been working on this for about a year and a half with a team of the mayor, working with Alderman Betancourt, working with our staff. We have Dan Deniska here, who's the assistant planner. Richard Shook is the zoning enforcement officer, and then our city attorney, Mike Driscoll. Again, they've been working with the mayor and myself and Mr. Betancourt. So we've been working on this probably for about a year and a half. We've read probably 30 ordinances from all over the country, different sizes of communities, different complexities, all the way from San Francisco and Portland, Oregon to Ledyard, Connecticut. I mean, and everything in between, like all different size communities, to see what nuances there are in short-term rentals. So we're going to just jump right into this to give you some time for questions and answers. So we're going to start about short-term rentals and our ordinance. So the draft ordinance that you have in front of you tonight has 7 sections. They have purpose, definitions, the standards and requirements, the owner responsibilities, licensing and procedures, violations, and penalties. So we recognize within the city there's properties that exist that are leased or rented on short-term basis, and they're usually arranged through internet service providers such as Airbnb. And short-term rentals in the city have generated many complaints that we've had to deal with, mostly regarding parking, noise, and illegal events on those residential properties. Currently, our local zoning regulations do not allow for any lodging uses in residential zones except for bed and breakfast. Those uses operate very differently than a short-term rental. You have someone that lives on site that's providing meals, and there's also that companionship factor. They're relating to you while you're there. So it's very different than a short-term rental. We also recognize, even hearing all the complaints, we recognize that when property regulated, that short-term rentals can benefit both owners and renters, people wanting to come to our city, and they provide that alternative lodging option to consumers. People like to have that little bit different feeling than being at a hotel. They like to have those amenities where you have cooking facilities and all those items that you would find in a normal single-family residence. So as of this map, and this was August of 2020, we have not received an update, but this was from Granicus, and there's at that time 71 rental units that were being leased out on separate individual units of short-term rentals in the city. The number fluctuates because people go on and they have their listing for a while and take it off. Circumstances may change, so it goes up and down, but at that point in time, there was 71. Okay, in our definitions section, right after purpose, we have definitions, and we have specific definitions of what a dwelling unit is, what a short-term rental is, what the short-term rental guest is, what primary residence and a primary residence rental is, who the property owner is, the non-resident owner description, property and local property representative. I'm not going to go over those descriptions, but they're in the draft ordinance for you. Okay, so then we have our next section, which is really important, which is our standards and requirements. So we have determined from our discussions, and again, this is all up for discussion with the council, but the group that's been meeting, we've looked at where it's appropriate to have short-term rentals in the city. And we've determined that short-term rentals that are located within a quarter mile of designated public transit routes is the best way we think to go in the city of Norwich. The rationale behind that is we want to encourage the use of our public transportation system. We want to cut down on those vehicle parking and traffic in neighborhoods that we get complaints about. And we want to keep the short-term rentals in locations that are close proximity to where our stores are, our restaurants are, and all those other tourist destinations that we have in the city and just outside of the city. So we really want to use that as our guide. And it's a unique approach. We haven't found that anywhere else, but we think it works here. So it's a little small to see here, but the potential short-term rental areas are the quarter mile from those transit routes, and we can't enlarge this, unfortunately. I do have a map that I can pass around. The transit routes are basically those little, you can't see the lines, but they're little box squares. Dan, there's no way to enlarge that, correct? At all. We'll see if we can get it any bigger for you. 1 second. Thank you. Let's see what we can do. Just give an example. So those little boxes, that's the bus transportation system, and the yellowy gold color is the quarter mile from there. So you can really see where we thought were the most appropriate places where short-term rentals should be based on transit. So Dan, if you want to, yeah, just kind of scroll around to show, and then maybe minimize the page again. And we found that a majority of the short-term rentals that you see that was on that previous page actually fall within this area as well. So it seems like it's the logical places for them to be in the city. So in the standards and requirements, we're going to continue on those. We also discussed a 500-foot buffer between non-resident owner properties, with the exception of a multi-story mixed-use building. So what that means is if you don't live on your property to manage your short-term rental, then we require 500 feet between them. So if I'm a non-resident owner and someone else is a non-resident owner, we have short-term rentals, we cannot be within we have to be at least 500 feet apart. And so we're not stacking neighborhoods with vacant homes that the owner's not living in, it just having a lot of short-term rentals really stacked on each other. Again, that separation distance is intended to minimize the impact on neighborhoods where there is no on-site owner living on the property to monitor that activity. Another standard is there shall be no building or housing code compliance notice of violations issued by the city to the present owner for a period of 6 months. And that's we want to make sure that we're ensuring that short-term rental licensee holders are only issued to those owners that are sufficiently maintaining their property. We want to make sure that they don't have violations so that those properties are appropriate for renters to be staying in. So then we also looked at a property owner, the number, how we would allow them to license. They may license to rent in a primary residence where they live on a short-term basis, no more than 2 bedrooms in their home under 1 license. So they wouldn't need multiple licenses because they live there. So they could have 2 residents at 2 bedrooms in their home, short-term use for different people to stay with them in their home. Again, the rationale is to allow an on-site owner of a residential home the ability to rent out a few rooms on a short-term basis to supplement their income and obviously manage what's happening there. A non-resident owner may apply to license a single-family dwelling as only 1 short-term rental only. So you can't rent out bedrooms. And the rationale is to prevent the separate rental of bedrooms when a property owner does not reside on site to manage those interactions between the guests. So if you live there, you could rent 2 bedrooms separately. If you don't live there, you have to rent the whole house out as 1 rental. And we'll get into a little bit more about that. There shall be an occupancy limit of 2 guests per bedroom. And that's to prevent any over-occupancy of bedrooms and to reduce the total number of people staying on that property. We want to keep that very low. Go ahead, Dan. In a single and 2 family dwelling unit, bedrooms for short-term rentals, this is for fire and health and safety rules, only can be on the 1st and 2nd floors. Once you get into the 3rd floor, we have issues with needing fire escapes, and basements, bedrooms are specifically prohibited. The windows are often small. We don't want people sleeping down there and to have any issues with fire code. So only on 1st and 2nd floor bedrooms would be able to be used as part of a short-term rental. The number of dwelling units we discussed, and again, this is up for discussion and flexibility with the council. We're still in the draft stage here. We looked at this and looked at multifamily buildings and mixed-use buildings and decided that we use this as an example for another community, that you should be able to have a little bit more if you live there in those units. So again, we're talking multifamily buildings, so we're talking 2 families and more, and we're talking about mixed-use buildings that might have commercial on the 1st floor and apartments above. So for this example here, if you have a 2-family and you're owner-occupied, you live in one of those units, you would be able to have 1 accessory short-term rental in the other unit. If you don't live there and you have a 2-family, you get 0. You can't have a short-term rental there. So the only way you'd get one if you're a 2-family is if you live in that other unit. A 3-family, again, owner-occupied, gets to have 2 of those units, could be short-term rentals. If you don't live there, only 1 of your, then a 3-family. And it goes on until we get to 6 to 9 units. owner occupied, we felt was 5, and then a non-owner would be 4 at 10 plus. So if we're talking a mixed-use building downtown or something that had 40 units, doesn't matter if you're owner occupied or non-owner occupied, 5 is the maximum that you could have. And that reasoning is, Dan, if you want to go to the next page, is really the rationale is to allow an increase in the number of short-term rentals in multifamily and mixed use when the building is the primary resident of the owner. Again, the cap of 5 ensures that there are available rentals that are long-term rentals for the public available, and it prevents a building from becoming a de facto hotel. We don't want a 40-unit apartment building to be 40-room hotel. And it shall be the responsibility of that owner of that multifamily building to notify any existing or prospective tenants that are renting there, the number and location of where those short-term rentals exist on the property. So if you have a 4-family and again you live there and you have 3 units, you need to be able to tell the people who are renting there that other unit, what units are going to be short-term rentals. They have a right to know people are going to be coming and going and that their neighbors may be changing daily. So we go into owner responsibilities, and we feel that the owner has some responsibilities, obviously, because this is what they want to do, and we want to make sure they're doing it in a way that's safe for our community. So the first responsibility is they need to advise renters that there's only a limit of 1 vehicle per bedroom. Again, we talked about the occupancy of 2 people in a bedroom, so they get 1 car. They can't come separately, they get 1 car. The location of parking is only on that paved or gravel driveway surface of the property. They cannot convert grassed areas, which I've jumped down to, but it's kind of related to that. They can't convert their lawn or landscape or take out their vegetation to create parking. We don't want to impact our neighborhoods by having big parking areas so people can do short-term rentals. On-street parking is allowed only where it's already permitted by the city of Norwich, and as a prohibition on utilizing the property for events. That's the big one. So we know that that has been an issue in the city, and the owner is responsible to advise their renters of this up front. They're going to have to take necessary steps to ensure that the renters are not going to disrupt the neighborhood or interfere with the rights of the neighbors' quiet enjoyment of their properties. And then they have to post some information, and that's the license number that they get assigned by the city, their contact information of the property owner. They can have a local property representative, so if the property owner lives out of state or out of the community, they need to have someone that's a requirement, the local property representative, their phone number. They need to know how many on-site parking spaces there are, the trash disposal and recycling protocol, emergency and non-emergency numbers for the police department, the Uncas Health District, and Norwich Public Utilities, and those are based on if they have septic system or if they have sewer. And they need to display a graphic of the fire escape plan in each of those guest rooms. So the next chapter here in our ordinance or section is licensing and procedures. And so the first thing is a license shall be required. So you can't do this in the city without having a license that's issued by the city. And only an owner shall be allowed to hold a license. So if you are a tenant there and you want to do this, you would not be permitted to do it. You have to be the owner of the property to get a license. Licenses are going to be allocated in the order that the applications are received into the city to make it fair. And once the total number of units for short-term rental has been reached, a wait list is going to be formed. And at this time, we looked at 100 is the number. Again, this is up for debate and discussion. So there shall be no more than 100 short-term rentals registered in the city in 1 calendar year. And that an individual or entity may only register up to 5 dwelling units or properties in the city per calendar year. So if you are an LLC and you're a member of that LLC, your name is an owner. So you, again, are held to just 5. So you can't do it under different LLCs. We're going to know that you're part of that. So a maximum is 5. So if you're an investor in the city, you would not be able to do more than 5 dwelling units. And again, a dwelling unit in a multifamily is going to be each of those units. It's not going to be per property. It's going to be dwelling unit. So there's the license application form, instructions, the self-inspection checklist, the public transit map, and the license fee information will be available at the Office of Planning and Neighborhood Services and on the city's website. And if the property for which the application is made is not the primary residence of the owner, the applicant has to certify the owner has complied with the provisions of in our Code of Ordinances, which is Article 5, Chapter 4, which is the landlord registration. In the past, that's been a little lax, but we feel if they're going to be applying for short-term rentals and it's not their primary residence, we want that information. And again, short-term rental license fee has yet to be determined, so we don't know what that's going to be, and we'll discuss that a little bit further along. And continuing the license and procedure protocols, we have the license is going to be valid through December 31st of each year. Licenses must be renewed annually, but no sooner than November 15th for the upcoming year. Licenses not renewed by January 31st shall be subject to a late fee of $100 per dwelling unit. So if you have a short-term rental and you're a little late, we're going to count that as long as you're licensed by that January 31st, you won't have a late fee. Failure to renew your license if you receive one from the city by February 15th of the year shall void the license. And again, you're voided, you go back onto the waiting list if there's any availability. Use of the property for short-term rental after a license expires obviously is a violation of the ordinance. License fees are allowed to be amended from time to time by action of the city council. And the proof of payment of real estate property taxes and fees is required for licensing. So if you are not current in your taxes, you need to be to get a license for a short-term rental. Owner's written sworn acknowledgement that the property is in compliance with the property maintenance code of the city of Norwich and our fire safety regulations. They need to have working smoke detectors and carbon monoxide detectors specified in our self-inspection safety checklist. They will have to sign that off to make sure that they have those. The fire marshal's office on multifamilies may go in on three units or more, but we allow them to also self-certify. The license shall be immediately suspended if there is a citation issued by the building or housing department or a violation of the city's fire safety regulations. And that suspension stays in effect until that citation is paid and the underlying problem is resolved. They need to submit a certificate of insurance specifying that they have general liability insurance of at least $1 million, and the policy must be issued by an insurer that's authorized to conduct business in the state of Connecticut. Most people who have rental properties have a liability insurance of $1 million, so this is pretty typical. Short-term dwelling units are located within a common interest community, such as condominium association, must provide proof from that association that the use of short-term rentals is allowed. This comes up pretty frequently. We get phone calls about it, if they would be able to do it in a condo. So if the association allowed for it, they'd have to submit that proof. Notification of any change in ownership or management, which is that local representative or a management company, must be submitted in writing to the city within 30 days. We need to know who that new owner is that has that license and that who the new manager is. And there will be a fee for updating and processing those paperwork reflecting the change, but that has yet to be determined. It does not extend the license. So if that change, you sell your property in November and that license ends December 31st, you don't get another year. You get till December 31st. Any applicant denied a license shall have 10 business days to appeal the denial in writing to me, to the Director of Planning and Neighborhood Services. The director shall hear and decide the appeal within 30 days. That is up for debate and discussion. That was just, our attorney felt very strongly that there needs to be an appeal process, and it thought it would be appropriate to be out of our office. Now we talk about violations. It shall be unlawful for the owners of any property located within the geographic bounds of the city to rent and operate or advertise for a short-term rental in any manner contrary to this ordinance or to state law. And a short-term rental guest and any invitee may not use a short-term rental for any purpose that's not incidental to its use for lodging and sleeping only. And this is where it's very clear in this ordinance that a short-term rental property shall not be used for a wedding reception, a bachelor or bachelorette party, a banquet, a concert, a fundraiser, a sponsored event, a corporate party, retreat, commercial activity, or any other special event. So, having a short-term rental is not the same property rights that you would have as an individual that owns your property, is living there, and has like a wedding for your daughter. And it's a once-in-a-lifetime event. This is a commercial type of venture, and we're not going to allow it to become venues that are going to really negatively affect our neighborhoods. The penalties. So obviously, if you have a violation, there's a penalty. So any property owner who violates any provision contained in this ordinance shall have committed a violation which may be enforced by citation and is subject to a fine not to exceed $250 for each violation. And the violations of the provisions of this ordinance shall be grounds to deny an application or a renewal application for a short-term rental license. And I think that's pretty much encompasses everything that we thought was important to have in a short-term rental ordinance. I think it's really clear. The definitions, I didn't go over them, but they describe which of those, what each of those are. Is there any questions and, like to talk about?
Deanna, the 500-foot set aside, is that property line to property line?
Yeah, it would be basically a buffer from the property line. And we do that for like special permits right now. There's a distance, is it 200 feet, I think it is right now? For special permits and for variance, is it 200 for the property line or is it 500? Yes, is what? 100, it's 100 feet. So we just basically take that foot and just blow it up. So the same thing would be 500 feet in all directions. So if you're on one street and your property abuts another street, again, that 500 feet. This is all up for debate. It could be shorter and it could be larger. Again, it's so we're not stacking them where people aren't living. So the resident short-term rentals, when you're living in that property, can be next door to each other because you're managing it. You live there. But it's the non-residents short-term rentals where people are not living on site that we want to make sure that they don't get stacked so you don't have multiple things going on in lots of traffic and lots of change of people who are staying there.
The license itself, is that subject to something similar to a certificate of occupancy prior to being granted? In other words, an inspection?
So it could be an inspection. They're going to have that self-inspection checklist, but if it's multifamily or it is a commercial mixed-use building, we'll probably work really closely with the fire marshal's office for them to go in and check certain things as well. So
Does that review grant or give by the fact that it's a home sometimes being occupied differently now, the right of the fire marshal or the building inspector to inspect other areas of the home that's being converted?
I think we'd have to discuss that and see, but we want to, if they are coming in for a license and saying, we're going to use these 2 bedrooms on our first floor, I think we have a right to look at making sure that we're not going to necessarily go up at the 3rd floor or anything, because they're going to tell us specifically in their application what units they're applying for, where they're at. So if I live on my property, I live in my house, and I have 2 bedrooms that I want to use as short-term rental under one license, because we're just giving you a break because you're living there and you want to rent out 2 units, we'll be able to say, it's a single-family house, you probably don't need to go there. They're probably maintaining it pretty well. But when we're talking multifamily homes that they're completely separate, I'm going to live on the site, but I don't really have interaction with going into that space, into that unit. They have their own full kitchen, their own full living environment. Those are the ones we're probably going to want to get into more than the single-family houses, Mayor.
My last question, those that have already we've somewhat identified as short-term rentals in the city, how do they line up with the current map that's proposed here?
Some of them, I think, would fall within the quarter mile of transit. And again, that's our goal, is to put them where it's appropriate for people to get on, use our buses and get around and visit. We need the ones that are in violation right now. We just need to get them on board to be registered and licensed and know the rules, and for the owners to follow those. I think that once this gets take off, I think the goal would be to try to get this so that November 15th we could start getting applications. And I think the ultimate goal would be to do it this year, unless we wanted to change the dates, and then it would be bumping it out. So I think if we wanted to stay on this track, it would be so that November 15th people could start applying for that license as of January 1st.
Last question. Those outside the quarter-mile radius, are you looking at some recommendation for perhaps grandfathering?
I'm sorry, I didn't.
Their location outside the quarter-mile radius, would you be recommending, if they already exist, even though it's not legal, you're not looking to?
No, because
Okay.
The standard is the standard, and that's what we're setting with the ordinance. It's not, even from a zoning standpoint, they wouldn't be allowed, because when you have an illegal use, a non-permitted use, it doesn't grandfather. You're only grandfathered if you had a use that was permitted, and we changed the rules and said in zoning, well, we don't allowing houses there anymore, and you have a house there, then you're grandfathered, existing non-conforming. So anybody that's operating one right now doesn't get grandfathered anything. They're doing it without permits and without licenses from the city right now.
Or the use predated zoning.
What?
It was an old use that predated zoning. It was an old use that predated zoning.
And then that would be existing non-conforming. If we can determine that it predated zoning, then it was there. But I don't think any of these short-term rentals really predated zoning.
No.
Alderman Durrell-Wilson.
Good evening. So I have just several questions. So
Sure.
one, I know last time we were having the discussion, we talked about the enforcement and different things of that sort. Would your office be able to handle enforcement. and things of
I
that
would
sort.
tell you that, again, we didn't talk about license fees, and one of the reasons we didn't really talk about license fees is I would really like to recommend to the council to outsource the enforcement and the permitting of the licenses and the collection of fees. There's companies that do that. We've been contacted by many of them since we started discussing this, and without giving you too much details, but I think under around $200 or less, I think would be for one unit. I think that that's an appropriate fee to collect, and they would do from the licensing, again, collecting the fee, doing the annual renewals, dealing with the complaints. If there's complaints, that would be, the number would be listed on there if there's a complaint, and we'd have it on our website. So we're not having local staff do it. They would get a hold of the local representative right away and say, hey, we've got noise complaints. You need to get over there and deal with it, or trash complaints and things. It would be the really appropriate way to do it is outsourcing. It's cost effective that way. We don't have our enough staff right now to handle it, but it's something that we do need to deal with at some point. So I think that's the best way. But if you think of it, and I'm an owner and I own 5 of these short-term rentals, which is the maximum that I can have. Potentially I'm paying $1,000 a year, and I can tell you right now they're making a heck of a lot more than $1,000 in a year on their short-term rentals, so that's a drop in the bucket for them, and it's the cost of doing business, is to do this. But it would cover, we're not looking to make money on this, we're looking to license it and have somebody be able to manage that for us. So we would go out, I'm imagining, to some kind of RFQ process to look at the different companies, because we have been approached by multiple.
Perfect, so that was question 1. My next question was, I know you talked about the different uses of the property, so multifamily versus single family, and the first and second floor usage, depending on what the house looks like. I know you explained of fire escapes, all of those things. Say a house was set up in a sense that they had all of those things. Would that be something where you would, it's a no because the standard is set at first and second floor?
Yes, it would be a standard that's set for first. And that we spent a lot of time talking about this with the fire marshal's office.
Okay.
There are some illegal short-term rentals in the city that are using the 3rd floor.
Gotcha.
And that is a real problem because they're not set up to have, and they're like a single-family residence, and they're not set up to have those fire escapes. Like usually when you have a 3rd floor, you may have a 3-family or something, or
Correct.
4-family on the 3rd floor. But again, we want to make sure that people can get out of those, and potentially they could. Maybe on a multifamily they could be. Again, we could discuss this, all these different nuances, but we looked at it and said, which one are we going to be worried about fire escapes from? And those would be 3 floors and above, but usually like in a single family. But if you're looking at something like a mixed-use building downtown, we might be okay with that being at an upper level. So I think it's really those single families, dwellings that we're concerned, and maybe we need to tweak the language, and the 3rd floors are not allowed in single family dwellings. Maybe we need to look at that.
And that's actually what I was getting
No,
at,
and
so
this
it's
is what's
perfect.
good conversation, because things come up and we have to look at that.
Perfect. And then my last question would be, I know you talked about owner-occupied versus non-owner occupied. So I have several friends across the country that have Airbnbs, for example, and I believe they have kind of a similar setup where it's either owner-occupied or non-owner-occupied. You get an owner that buys one property where he's going to stay on the same street, but he buys the property next door that he wants to be a short-term rental. In that sense, even though they are there to take care of that other property, you're going to consider the short-term rental a non-owner occupied.
Yes, but
Okay.
that person though can be the local property representative because they're local.
Okay.
So they'd still not be able to be considered an owner occupied because they don't live there.
Correct.
And we base the owner occupied on what their tax address is. It's specifically in here. It's like, I can look at exactly what it says. Let's see. Okay. I'm just trying to find where it says it here. Just give me 1 second. Primary residence means a dwelling in which an owner resides as a legal residence for more than 6 months a year and registers as their address for tax and government identification purposes. So if they're not living in there, they're in 6 months of the year, and that's not where their taxes are going to, and that's not their primary residence. So they
Correct.
don't get the benefits of that. But again, they can be the local property representative, not have to pay anybody else. They can run over
Correct.
and take care of stuff.
Okay. And then just one that I thought about. You said as of right now, they're around 70?
Yeah, I think it's
short-term
about
rentals?
70, yeah.
So you're thinking out, 100 would be a good enough starting point, I'm guessing.
We think, because those are the ones that we know about that are advertising, so maybe word of mouth, there might be more out there, we're not sure.
Okay.
One thing we didn't talk about, but it's in here very specifically, is what is the description of a dwelling unit too. And I
Correct.
think I should tell you that I want to say that specifically prohibited from being a dwelling unit is RVs, tents, garages, boats, tree houses, playhouses, sheds, caretakers' quarters associated with commercial or industrial uses, and any other space which not otherwise would require an issuance of a certificate of occupancy from a local building official. So it's not really, if it's not a building and you don't get a CO for it, you can't use it as for a short-term rental. You know, I know people love to think about how great it would be to have a little camper out there or a tree house, but we have to make sure that what people are renting are safe, and that we want to make sure that they have they were COable, they have a certificate of occupancy. So, but yeah, I hope that answers your questions.
Nope, that answers it perfectly.
Okay, good.
Thank you.
Good.
Alderman Bettencourt, please.
Just one thing about the tax issue. So I was thinking that, what about someone that was, say, on a payment plan? Only because, I mean, this might facilitate someone getting current on their taxes, that's all.
I mean, we can have that discussion. I think that that's really valid. You know, if someone's made a payment plan with the city and it's an authorized payment
they're
plan with the
current,
city.
you know.
And they're current. I mean, again, I'm not making this decision, it's your ordinance, but I think that we could write that in such a way that either they're current on the payment or have an authorized payment plan or something like that in here with the tax office. Change the language a little bit to be a little bit more flexible. But the goal is to make sure that people aren't buying properties, not paying their taxes, and collecting money for short-term rentals, and making sure that they're maintaining them in appropriate ways and they're keeping them attractive and they're not affecting the neighborhood with traffic and noise and parties and things. We really want to see this successful. It's a really cool thing to have in your communities. I mean, it's happening anyways, but we either embrace them or put our heads in the sands like a lot of communities do. That's another option, is we found that the ostrich approach, which is we're not going to deal with this, we're going to put our head in the sand and let it happen. Those are mostly communities where there's been like a lot of beach houses that have been rented for weeks at a time over summers for 50 years, whatever people went. But what's happening is those summer cottages that were rented for a week or two or a month are now going not only in the summer, they're year-round, and they're weekly or sometimes daily rentals and things. So even those places are really looking at how they want to manage them. Norwich doesn't have that kind of community, so this is an opportunity for us to decide what's best for Norwich and how we want to regulate them.
Alderman Gould.
Two questions. We have good property owners, and then we have the poor ones. How do we, if we had to, close them down? If they don't get a license, they have multiple violations, they self-reported that they're only renting out 3 bedrooms, and we find out they're renting 5. Mm-hmm. Do you see a company that could be hired to handle this, also handling, the closing of?
So yes,
and how do we enforce that, other than, because we could stick them with all the fines we want, but they're still renting out those bedrooms illegally.
I mean, any kind of enforcement is difficult, let's be honest. Zoning enforcement, any kind of code enforcement is really hard to get compliance. So in this particular case, I would say that whoever company that we would use, if the council decided that's the route that we were going to do, is that we were going to outsource. The companies we've talked to all do enforcement. So what they will be doing is they constantly are monitoring what comes on the market. So it's not something that we just hear a complaint. If they're looking, it's automatically 24 hours a day, digitally looking at what new things come on the market. So if they know they've registered these, say 70, say that we only have 70 that come forward, and all of a sudden a bunch bumps, they see another 10 of them. They'll first notify them and say, you don't have a license to operate, you're in violation, please apply for the license. If there's any more available, and they're not, they'll automatically get that you're in violation of our ordinance, the licenses are already been distributed, you can apply next year, immediately cease your operation, is a $250 fine, and I would speak with Attorney Driscoll about this, but I believe that the fine would be per day. as far as I'm concerned, or for, because if they operate to do it again, and they have another person renting there, every time they advertise, it's a new violation. So it could be very expensive for someone. So I don't think it's a one-shot deal of like, you get fined $250, and people go, hey, my rental is, $200 a night. I don't care if I pay you $250. But if it's continually going on until that violation is resolved, then I think it could be very costly to someone. And the goal is really not to put a hammer down on it, is to get really great short-term rentals in the city. Have the people living there, maintaining them, keeping their properties up, because we find that the people who do own short-term rentals have some of the most attractive properties in the city. They're not renting them out as dives. People don't want to stay in a dive, so they really are doing a great job managing their properties, and we do think from an aesthetic standpoint, the neighborhoods are going to could look nicer, with some of these as a neighbor. It's those other things that come along with it. And if you're not living on the property, having a really great local property representative that's going over there, making sure that the garbage is taken out, and those kind of things, and those protocols are being followed. But, people are asking for this. It's a really trendy thing. We've known it's been going on for probably 10 years now, really. But in Norwich, I think has been more of a proliferation of them probably in the last couple of years. And again, this is really in the council's hands. We're trying to guide you and help you by giving you an option here with an ordinance, but it's really up to you of how you want to proceed with this. And we're here to assist.
And one more question, I just want a clarification. So I own my home, and I buy the house next door. So I could rent out 2 bedrooms in my home, and now I can rent out 2 bedrooms in that home.
You wouldn't be able to rent 2 bedrooms in that home, because if you don't live there and it's a single-family residence, you rent the whole thing as one rental.
Okay, so I can rent the whole thing?
Yep.
But do I have to be within that 500 feet or no?
So this is where, so in that non-resident property that you have that one, so that next, another one that's a non-resident owner, there can't be another one within 500 feet of that one, not of your house, because it doesn't matter that if you're living there, you're not penalized because you're living there. It's only the the properties that don't have a resident owner on site. They have to be 500 feet from each other. There's no separation between you and the one next door, yours. Like the house you're living in and you own the one next door, but the one next door that's rented out as one single family rental cannot have another one within 500 feet where the owner doesn't live there. But if the owner lived on the other side, another owner on the other side had one, it's okay. Because the whole thing is it doesn't get impact. We find by reading all these ordinances and all the different stories about short-term rentals, when the owners live there, they're going to be attentive to who they're renting to because they're staying in their house with them.
Right.
You don't want to have guests that you're uncomfortable with. They're a guest in your home, but you're not a bed and breakfast. You're not providing them meals, but they are staying in one of your bedrooms. And again, the reason that we have that there's no rental of separate bedrooms in a single family where there's no resident owner there is because we don't want people who don't know each other, strangers, renting multiple bedrooms in a house together because it could be complete boarding house chaos, without anyone there. So you can rent that house as one unit together. So if it's a 3-bedroom house and I have 2 friends, it's one rental. We rent it together, they pay me, and we rent the house, and we stay there overnight, and we go to the casino, and we go to Uncas Leap, and we eat downtown. That's the goal,
Okay, I just wanted to make sure about that.
So you don't have a separation from your house where you live to
But-
that one?
But the one on the either side of me would have to have a 500-foot buffer.
Only if, there's only the 500-foot buffer between non-resident owner properties. So if your house is here, like your house and you live there and you have your 2, and then you own the house next door and you got a short-term rental of that house. On the other side of you, if that person has a 1-bedroom in their house, they want to rent 1 bedroom as short-term rental, there's no separation distance from you 3. It's from the house that you just said that you're not living in to another house that the owner isn't living in.
Okay,
And that's what it is.
okay. All right, thank you.
Okay?
Other questions? Just one more then.
Sure.
The tax issue was proposed, talked about. How about utilities? Since utilities are municipally owned as well, in the past, people can't even be appointed boards and commissions if they're behind that type of thing. So would you recommend that with utilities?
I don't know, and the reason, I mean, again, that would be up to you, is I think it might be, again, it's also how our computer systems work, because whoever we work with on the outside is going to have to verify that the taxes are paid. You know, they say, okay, my taxes are paid, there's going to have to be either internally or access to be able to verify the taxes are paid on the property. I don't know if they'll have the same ability with NPU to make sure that their NPU service is up to date and paid. So we'd have to look into that. But if it's something that you wanted, we have to figure out the nuances. Maybe that's one thing that our staff has to do on their behalf. Because we're not talking a ton of them for licensing. It's the enforcement. It's the, you know, it's the beginning initial thing is not the hard. It's the enforcement and staying on top of, is there new ones coming on the market that we don't know about? We only hear about it word of mouth. These companies will automatically be looking and searching through their databases by the advertising that goes on online, because that's where they're primarily advertised, not in newspapers like they, you know, we do for an apartment for rent. These things are really digitally handled.
I ask that only because we have a significant number of people, because of the impact of COVID, that are on long-term payment plans now, much more than we probably would have seen.
So we can definitely have that conversation, and I think with Attorney Driscoll here, he'd be someone that definitely could provide some insight on that and what we should do. But again, this is really our first draft. I think it's a great draft. I'll be honest with you, we worked on it really hard, and I really appreciate Alderman Betancourt and the mayor and Mike and the staff here, Rich and Dan. Everybody put their heads together and tweaked it a lot. We did show it to Granicus, the last company that did a presentation here, and they said, well, you could just, you know, modify your description of what we call a bed and breakfast, and we were like, that doesn't really feel like it really meets all the things that we need to address here. I think that was the easiest, simplest solution, is just say, you know, bed and breakfast is now a place that you don't get food necessarily, that you can stay at someone's house, but that would be only allowing them to be where there's a on-site resident owner, and that's another option. Some communities say that you have to have a resident owner that lives there, and you can't have a short-term rental unless they live on site. Again, we are trying to allow as many investment opportunities in the city as well, because we do know people do buy the residents in the city and properties in the city and like to fix them up, and they've done a great job with doing that, and they don't live on site. But doesn't mean they're legal right now. They're not, and we'd like to get them into becoming legal, and knowing that we have very strict criteria against all those event venues, which has really been one of the major problems with the short-term rentals in the city right now, in the parking.
Thank you.
All right, 7:15. Thank you. 8:45.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, and we'll go back to the drawing board, and we would really appreciate if you have comments after reading this again. The aldermen want to send me and Dan or Rich or anybody the specific comments that they have, or questions or things, that nuances they want us to look at, and we'll probably be meeting again in the next few weeks and talking about where we go from here. And if everyone says they like it and they send it forward to me, hey, we think it's just great the way it is, we'll probably come forward with an ordinance at some point, and again, talk about the dates if we want to try to get this adopted, so in time for November. Okay? Thanks so much, guys. Thank you. All right.